Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of Brogressive Podcast. Today, we're joined by Matthew Yglesias. I think most people know who he is if you're watching our podcast. I know we do. We're big fans. He's one of the most influential political thinkers and writers in modern politics, co-founder of Vox. Has ran for like the Atlantic, the New York Times. He's also the author of 1 Billion Americans and currently runs the Slow, Boring Substack, where he covers U.S. politics and policy, ranging from literally anything. I was reading something about, I was reading economic policy. I was reading your manifesto for what Democrats should do. Really
Yeah,
insightful information on there. We're going to cover a lot of that in today's episode. And you can also subscribe to that. We'll link that in the description. We'll have that on our social media pages. Read his stuff because it makes me sound a lot smarter when I'm sitting around my family's, Christmas dinner and they're bringing up random shit. Matt also is the co-host of the Politics podcast. So you can also subscribe to that, and we'll link everything. So thank you so much for joining us today, Matthew. I know it was a quick turnaround. You're like, who are these random young men on the other side of the country who are contacting me on a random, what was like a random Wednesday? So we really, really do appreciate it. If you want to give a little spiel about yourself before we get into anything, go ahead.
sure. I loved the name the moment I saw it. I thought
We fought about the
progressive.
name so much.
I thought this is what we need. It's funny. I'm a man myself. I used to be young, but now I'm old. And I think so. I was I think not so different from you guys. I mean, I was interested in politics when I was a kid, and I was in college, and blogs were like a kind of brand new thing around 2001, 2002. I just kind of decided one day. I'd been an intern on Capitol Hill, which I think some of you guys were. I worked in Chuck Schumer's office. This was a primitive time, so I spent a lot of time faxing things to people.
What's faxing? Can you explain that?
Oh, I actually wonder. I mean, do people? Do you guys know what a fax machine is? Like,
Is that
I
just a
actually
printer
don't
machine?
understand it.
It's like a scanner and a computer, like where you email all in one, right? But it was like really big block, right? Something like that, or like you know?
okay, so right, so it's essentially a printer and a scanner and an emailer, right? But before people had email, right? So you would have a fax machine and you could dial another fax machine's telephone number, and then you could put a piece of paper in the fax machine. It would scan it. It would transmit over analog telephone signals the information about what was on your piece of paper, and then the other fax machine would print it out. And
Wait, that's kind
so
of cool. Why don't we have that today? Hold up.
uh, I mean, they
It's true.
exist. So, by the time I was in Schumer's office, I mean, email existed, the internet existed. It wasn't that long ago. But old people who were old then, still primarily communicated on paper documents. So if we would write a press release, my boss would print it out and I would grab it off the printer and I would go to the fax machine. And this was an advanced fax machine. So there were different codes that would blast fax to different groups of people. So you could hit like all upstate television stations and it would send them there, right? Or just like print statewide. Anyway, it was a stupid job, but I learned a lot about politics from Schumer's people there. And I was back at school, and I was like, let me start a blog. I can do this. I can write on the internet. My roommate was a computer science major. He helped me at a time when there wasn't as good software and tools for stuff like that. And I've really just been doing that same shit ever since. I mean, I got a job out of school based on blogging. My editor at the time in the magazine was like, "This blog stuff's good, but you got to learn to write magazine articles." And I never did. I just been writing on the internet for 20 something years ever since. I stopped being young. We had generational changes at the time. Um, Young people, millennials, as we are known, when we were in our 20s, were the most left-wing cohort in America. And there was a lot of, upheaval and tussle inside institutions and stuff about that. And then people younger than me, including. But now, we're coming around to a time when people my generation are middle-aged now or getting there. and the cohort that's coming up is more conservative. And I think that's been
Yeah.
discombobulating to a lot, particularly people. I'm a pretty moderate Democrat, but people who are like more left wing than me were really accustomed to thinking that history was on their side, that even if an idea might have been too edgy for 2014 or 2016, that by 2024, it would all, because that's the way the gay marriage issue played out in our lifetime, a lot of different things. And just kind of a feeling that the world was inevitably going to turn our way. And I think this past election has been a real shattering moment to those illusions that Republicans can just win. They can win popular votes, that young people might decide that they're Republican or that they're at least more conservative about certain kinds of things, and that, Democrats need to take politics seriously, both on a messaging and a substance level, which to people slightly older than me or the people, I worked for when I was an intern would have been second nature. 90s Democrats, pre-2004 Democrats, knew life was tough and that winning elections is always an uphill fight.
Yeah, I thought something. I was reading this thread from Tyler DiNucci a couple weeks ago after the election, where he was talking about how Gen Z being more conservative in some ways than millennials. He was talking about how millennials kind of built for lack of a better term, like the woke cancel culture mob or whatever, to use those terms, and that was something that kind of young people never bought into. That Gen Z never had a chance to kind of build that. They grew up in that world, whereas from millennials, that was the counterculture. Building that thing was like, we're pushing back against the older generation. Whereas young people kind of grew up in this world that was created by millennials, where everything they said online could be used against them. And they sort of were like, we never really agreed to this setup. And so I'm kind of wondering, what are your thoughts on the Gen Z shift? Is it entirely just TikTok brain poisoning, or do you think that there's sort of a more like structural cause behind it?
But there's a lot of things happening. So one thing that I believe, I mean, I know this is somewhat controversial, but I think it's correct, is that, most people inherit political ideas from their parents. And we have sort of two waves, generational waves in American politics. You think of these kind of greatest generation squares who were running everything, and then baby boomer rebels, hippies and campus radicals and things like that. And then Gen X, who were the kids of the greatest generation people, are more right wing. And, in the 80s, this was a big theme. Young Reaganites who were appalling the sort of newly growing up ex-hippie baby boomers. Then you have millennials who are those baby boomers' kids and are left wing again, just like the baby boomers' parents were like the New Deal leftists. And then, you have this greatest generation X Zoomer, more right wing kind of counter cadence. But then there's also is all this life experience stuff. I'm a little bit too old for like cancel culture. Like I was out of college. I graduated in 2003. And it's people who are younger than me, like came into my workplace having been like veterans of these campus social justice wars. And you're right, though, that they to themselves were rebels, right? They were sort of leading the charge of progressive change to shake up the system. But they succeeded, and in some cases over succeeded, and they became the system, right? And it's natural for young people, especially young men, to kind of chafe against limits and, want to be irreverent and things like that. And what is reverential, guys your age, I mean, obviously, some people grow up in religious households. We have conservative communities in America, but the hegemonic Christian right culture that dominated American society when I was young was dead by the time you guys were teenagers. And I think it's not meaningful. I mean, again, I grew up in the West Village in New York, so it's not like I grew up in like a stultifying religious community, and some people continue to do that today. But even so, growing up in a progressive neighborhood and a progressive family, I was aware of what the dominant cultural mores of America were. But to kids your age and younger, the dominant, particularly in schools and educational settings, the kind of dominant tone is this very but like the pieties of our time were sort of left-wing progressive ones. And I think that's tough on young people in general and young men in particular.
There's an anecdote that I like. The only political thing I remember about elementary school, it was like during the 2016 Democratic primaries. And so like obviously in fourth grade, my political beliefs were very like influenced by my parents, and everybody
Yeah.
was like fourth graders were very excited about Bernie Sanders. And I was like, no, Bernie Sanders wants socialism, and if he becomes the presidential nominee, then nobody is going to want to work, and society is going to like be destroyed. But I remember like I was a minority voice in like fourth grade, so I feel like that kind of encapsulates maybe the sentiments and the shift in like just the de facto culture.
Once again, it's a little silly, but like actually, I think David's kind of nailed it on the head. I did grow up in like a fairly rural, like religious community, and I think you guys kind of nailed it on the head. It's like same thing, except this was 2012, and it was Mitt Romney's going to bring back the good school lunches that Obama got rid of. So it's one of those like,
No.
yeah, dude, I'm telling you, it was for like you would have little like. I don't know. We must have been like 9 going around on the playground being like, guys, you tell your parents to vote for Mitt Romney. He's going to bring back like the good lunches. And I'm like, I
Oh
don't know what they're gonna do
no,
with that.
Max, you fell into the trap.
Dude, I
But you
did.
know that
I wanted the lunches. I wanted my Scooby snacks.
I remember voting for Mitt Romney in a mock election and feeling like
You guys
I
are
felt
off
like I
this
was voting for
podcast
like I
on
felt like I was
that.
voting for like Putin's opponent in like a presidential election. Like I had to hide my ballot, and like I was going to be like
That is
these are
pretty
also
funny.
these are so random anecdotes that I haven't thought about in such a long time. But
No, but
Well,
it's telling. So there's a famous David Short tweet, but he's from, I think it was some cycle, but he was saying that high school mock elections were indicating to him that Generation Z was going to be very conservative. And it's sort of come to pass. All this stuff, right? The generational analysis is mediated to some extent by race and ethnicity, right? So the current youth cohort is much less white than senior citizens. And that, to some extent, lifts Democrats up, right? But if you look at ideological affiliation in race-specific terms, like the baby boom cohort isn't all that left-wing, but considering how white it is, it's like extremely left-wing.
Well,
And
I think they
the
voted for
Zoomer,
Kamala this time around too, right?
yes, and the Zoomer cohort is not that right wing, but if you consider how diverse it is, it's like
yeah.
shockingly right wing. Right. So I mean, if a
Yes.
group of African Americans is 70-30 Democrat, that's a very Democratic group of people in objective terms, but it's a very Republican group of Black people, right? And so you see a lot of that kind of stuff going on. And in some ways that's like progress as a society, right? Having like heavily racially
Republicans
stratified.
becoming more diverse.
Yeah, well, but just like having super racially stratified voting.
Yes.
Like my grandparents, they're Jewish and they're dead, but they never would have voted for a Republican. Like it wouldn't matter.
yeah,
Like what the issues were, what anybody was saying. It was totally unthinkable to them. And that was a sign of the times, like in a bad way.
Well, talking about young people kind of rebelling against sort of the status quo, I'm curious because I feel like a lot of the complaints about like the language that liberals use or just some of the like crazy far left stuff, a lot of the response to that has been that Democratic politicians don't actually do that.
Uh-huh.
That it's kind of people who are associated with the Democratic Party. And I think that's very true for young people, where
It's the
not.
consultant class.
But even more than that, it's the people posting TikToks crying after Trump won or whatever.
Well,
It's those people that create the image. So I'm kind of curious, like, is there anything Democrats can do when it's such a like bottom up thing building their image, especially among young people? Like obviously you can't just like police all the academia people or just all the crazy people who are going to go viral on libs on TikTok or whatever. But is there anything Dems can do to kind of alleviate the bottom up part of their image building, or is it just try to top down and hope it trickles down to the regular Democratic voters? What would be the best strategy?
So I mean, I think there's like three things, right? One is you could try to lift up and elevate like better voices, right? Like that's a reason I said yes. Like I want to come on this show. Like I want you guys to be successful. And people who are older and more established can try, this was something again, when I was a young blogger, right? There was like a question like, should Democrats engage with the net roots? It's like ancient history stuff, but people used to talk about it. And Harry Reid and his team was like very smart about reaching out to, I think, like the best of what was in emerging new media and try to raise the profile of voices who were good and constructive. And so I think Democrats need to do that in the TikTok space and the podcast space, and also need to recognize that that means not necessarily the most like, it means like not the leftiest people, but also not the most like necessarily 100% on the money down the line.
Not the most political people too.
Right, exactly. So
Yeah.
engage, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is like, yes, like people who post on social media just need to be told from the top down. Like this is a free country and you can post whatever kind of insane counterproductive shit you want if you want to. But like, if you are choosing to express yourself about politics on broadcast social media, that's presumably for some kind of reason, right? Like, why are you doing this? If the reason is I care about people's health insurance, and so that's why I'm posting about Luigi, like, well, you should try to make your post be good, right? And now there's a question of like, what does it mean to be good? But it's like, if you care about the substance of issues, you should try to be responsible in what you do. And that's something that like we all as a community need to say to each other. Third, and like I think probably most important, is to recognize that I think it's less true that this stuff is like outside the scope of what political leaders can do. Something that young people are acutely aware of is that schools exist in America and are influential institutions. This is also something that I, as a parent, am aware of. I have a 9-year-old. He's in public school. I think a lot of the Democratic Party right now is run by sort of like childless 30 and 40 something.
Was JD Vance right, Matthew? No.
I'm not going to say cat ladies. No, I'm just going to say you can get very disconnected from this stuff and not understand that like one of the main things the government does is like run schools.
Yeah.
Right. And if schools are being run poorly or like overrun with like weird far left stuff, like that is a responsibility of the government to address and to like actually think about what is being like messaged to people and how are these institutions functioning. And colleges, higher education is a little bit more distanced from the government, but not entirely so, right? And so it's like, you have to accept responsibility for these kind of things, that a lot of people feel that there is big problems in these educational institutions. And like, you can't just say, well, sometime in Obama's second term, we decided that the policy agenda was like climate and childcare. And so we're just going to move on with that robotically. If people are upset about conditions on campus, about things that are happening in K-12 schools, like politicians need to be responsive to what it is people actually care about.
I feel like one super particular aspect of that like particularly frustrates me, but I wouldn't be surprised if really kind of plays into urban poor governments among Democrats, is the elimination or closure of like any kind of advanced programs in a lot of public schools, whether it's just like in like the city right next to mine, like they eliminated their like advanced math for 6th graders. And I'm like, that's just, it doesn't make any sense. And it's frustrating. So
Well, I was gonna say, Matt, you had written something about that, and I was gonna say that was one. I mean, truth be told, when I listened to some of your publications on Substack, I like to use the audio version. I would take my dog for a walk, but you had written something about that. I want to say it was in San Francisco, right, where they had eliminated the math requirements, like you said, the advanced requirements. That had happened in my community too, and like, not to be Mr. like, oh, I was advanced in 6th grade, but like, it's like you said, that outcome for all kids, right? When you put the kids that are doing algebra at 11, 12 with kids that can barely, multiply, it just hurts all of us. Like it created like you'd written, but I mean, I lived it, like that dynamic of the other kids are angry with you because you're flying through the homework and just sitting there bored, and then they're struggling, and then it's this weird power dynamic, and it's one of those things where just I think that, like you had said too, with the childless people, if these people who are having kids living in rural or suburban areas are not like are seeing all these problems, it becomes that weird dichotomy of like they're living in this reality, we're living in this one, and like you got to reconcile those two. We can't just ignore it and be like, nope, sorry, you're wrong.
Yeah, fortunately, I think it's believe San Francisco has turned 180 on that. They had a ballot initiative and they got it fixed. But yeah, I mean, this is something that I frequently find myself disagreeing with childless friends about, because they'll be like, what's the big deal? Whatever. Or they can be very sort of abstract, ideological, like, I think this is more egalitarian, whatever. But, Democrats forever have had the brand as the party that cares about public education. And at the end of the day, I mean, Democrats are, in fact, the party that, like, if there's a problem in the schools that it requires money to address, like, Democrats will spend the money, whereas Republicans would just as soon not have public schools exist at all, right? Like, they don't care on some level. But if you want to maintain and earn that brand, like, you need to care in a specific way, like day to day, like, are the schools working well? And it's like, it's a little bit tough. Nobody wants to hear, okay, my kid has been like selected for the low math track. So I get why you get pushback to those things, but it's not like feasible for teachers to do their jobs in a classroom of totally disparate abilities.
I was gonna say, if I had to guess too, I would feel like there's really a low payoff, because I don't feel like kids that are not as good and parents of kids that are not as good as math are gonna be like, all right, great, we eliminated the like specialized advanced math tracks. I would guess there's a very small amount of people that are like, all right, this is great. I feel like I'm being like seen by the district, and like the programs
And we
are being
saw that
adjusted.
it lost.
It's just more that people who like families of kids that would be doing those specialized programs that are upset that they don't exist. Like, I feel like there's not a real payoff at all. There's no like constituency for getting rid of like advanced programs.
That I think that who they are listening to, if it's not actually leading to any big payoff and there's not a big constituency in favor of it, is the groups that pushed that initiative that said that it was kind of racist to have these advanced math programs. So I'm wondering if you could kind of explain to our listeners some of the discourse around the groups, kind of what the groups are, and sort of their impact in politics, especially Democratic politics, over the last like 6 to 8 years since Obama.
Yeah. So, I mean, you go back, Obama was president. He had these very large congressional majorities in 2009, 2010. And, he got a lot done, but he did not get done certain things that people wanted him to achieve, right? I mean, he made some meaningful progress on climate change, but he never passed like a quote unquote big climate bill. And he couldn't get comprehensive immigration reform done. Like, he didn't have the votes there. And I would say, starting in Obama's second term and continuing afterwards, what sort of progressive muckety mucks, people with money, people with smart, big ideas, what they came up with was that they need to invest in an infrastructure that would essentially police Democrats, right? To avoid a recurrence of the situation where you would have 58, 59, 60 senators, but not be able to pass sweeping legislation because the Democrats were not uniformly progressive. And this was very successful. By, 2021, Democrats were much more uniformly left-wing than they had been in 2009. And it was possible to pass bills through a 50-50 Senate. At the same time, it was a 50-50 Senate rather than a 60-40 Senate. And the 50-50 Senate was living on borrowed time because it needed Joe Manchin's seat. It needed Sherrod Brown's seat. It needed John Tester's seat. It's hard. It's hard to win a Senate race in Ohio these days. That's a Republican state. Everybody spent, a year being so mad at Manchin for being a troublemaker and saying, I wish you could be more like Tester or Brown. But there's no way to win in Ohio and Montana as a kind of an orthodox progressive. So I would say that this whole, exercise of sort of creating this progressive infrastructure whose purpose is to enforce orthodoxy, it hasn't really worked in the kind of like big picture legislative politics. And then I think when we look at mass politics downstream, it has backfired, right? Because it is said to people who are not that political, right? I mean, there's a ladder of political engagement, right? But let's say you're at the 40th percentile of political engagement, right? That means you will almost certainly vote in a presidential election, might vote in off-year elections, probably won't vote in primaries, but you might. You read some politics news. So people who are like that, people who are down on the ladder of engagement, they have opinions about certain policy issues, but that they care about. And then they have lots of stuff that they don't care that much about. And they're not like learning, like, what's the quote unquote right view for someone like me to have about an issue that doesn't impact me personally, that nobody in my family talks about, whatever. And on the progressive side, they're very fastidious, right? There's all these people who will tell you, you can't say that. If you believe that, you're a bad person, right? They're in effect, what they were supposed to be doing is like getting an elite coalition to vote for bills. But what they're communicating to a mass audience is if you are heterodox at all, we want you out the door. And you should go join the other coalition where if as long as you're like, oh, Trump, he seems fine. It's like, congratulations, you're a Republican.
Welcome to
right?
the GOP.
They don't give you a list
they don't care.
of 50 different things that you're all supposed to believe. And the left is like, well, like you can't laugh at that joke. You can't like this show, like you can't think this, you can't do that, you can't do that. And
it starts to piss people off.
It's counterproductive.
Yes.
Because people hear what you're saying, right? Now, someone who's super engaged, right? So like I was talking to a member of Congress and she was complaining to me about the rhetoric of chest feeding. You guys know about this?
Yeah, the thing about with the
yeah.
Gotcha.
And
like
she was
like birthing people.
Right. And she was like, this makes me so mad, blah, 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 blah. And I said, like, well, would you ever say that? And she's like, no. Like I don't want that fight. She said, like, I use the language that I'm comfortable with. I talk about pregnant women. I talk about breastfeeding. I don't let these people bully me.
Is chest feeding really a thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
There's no way.
So, right. But like, that's the point. It's like, this is an actual member of Congress, right? So she's overcommitted to Democratic Party politics. And she's gonna, if people are like, don't pick this fight, she's not gonna do it. But a regular person is just gonna be like, whatever, you're fucking crazy.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go walk to the other side of the street. And so, that's why you need to build go back to the bigger tent kind of
inclusive coalition that Obama built in 2008.
It says, look, we have our 20 issues. And if you are with us on 11, that means you're with us. Like, that's what we're trying to get you to do, is to say, like, we are the better party of the two. We want you to vote for us if you agree with some of our main shit. Not in order to be allowed in our team, you are going to have to meet this like really high bar of exactitude that, only like really conformist, sort of like dim-witted people can possibly meet.
Yeah. No, I mean, I've been saying this for such a long time. I think that, from my own experiences talking to not just like young men, but people around me, a lot of people just say that Democrats tend to speak at them, not speak with them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think something that Democrats do, and I used to do this a lot where people would talk about the border, right? And I used to say, well, don't talk about immigration or the border because you're just feeding into the right wing. This happened early in like Biden's presidency when a lot of Republicans were complaining about the border and immigration. I was like, well, it's just overblown. The right-wing media is making out to be bigger than it is. But no, as we learned, a lot of fucking people cared about the border. They cared about immigration. They didn't think Biden was doing a good job at it. I think same thing with crime. I remember listening to like Nate Silver in I think 2021, and he was, breaking down the stats and was like, hey, actually, crime isn't that bad. It's actually been on, at that time, I think the trend was starting to go down, but we were still seeing some spikes from COVID. But he said, but people don't feel safe, right? And that's what it comes to at the end of the day. people don't feel safe. People don't feel like the border's secure. People, you can tell people, you can give people all these statistics and these stats and these facts and tell them, hey, well, you're wrong. And actually, violent crime is down in these specific cities, but you can't tell people how to feel. And I think Democrats do that a lot, right? And then I think that also comes from like we tend to be a little more elite when we speak, right? And that alienates people who might agree with us, right? I was talking to a buddy of mine who didn't vote this past election, and he was like, I agree with Democrats on healthcare. I agree with Democrats on like environmental issues, but I just don't want to be told what to say. I don't want to be told what to feel. At the end of the day, we need to stop telling people how to feel, and especially, about their own communities. And this is the bigger conversation about homelessness that I get into on Twitter all the time with left-wing activists who are like, well, you can't treat homeless people like this. But then at the same time, they're pushing for more people to use public transportation. And I tweeted out, hey, you want more people to use public transportation? You're going to have to do something about homeless people doing drugs on the side. Like, in a sympathetic way, you have to do something.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, some of this is just about like being more chill, but some of it is like, you know, politics. Like you have to uh take, you have to take seriously what people say their
Yes.
problems are in life. Not like you're governing, you can do other things. You're allowed to like pass bills that
Focus on other
others
issues
don't
too.
care
Yeah.
about. But you can't just be like, well, this is again, I mean, part of what the groups have done is create this kind of enforced ideological rigidity. But the other thing is that like there are criminal justice reform groups that were created, and there aren't any like let's have there not be crime groups, right? And it was
Yeah.
similar, right? This whole Biden thing on the border, people are going to look back on it and they're going to find it very puzzling, right? Because at some point, um, pro-immigration, immigrant-friendly legislation is going to pass Congress. Whether it's in some Nixon goes to China Trump version or it's going to be the Gallego administration down the road, like it's going to happen. And when it does happen, pro-immigration legislation is not going to say, just like kind of whoever can show up and then say they have an asylum claim and then kick around the country for 5 to 7 years
Yeah.
while waiting for the claim to be adjudicated. And then if they commit some crimes while they were doing that, they don't get deported. Like that's
Let them
crazy,
stay.
right? Like that's not what a pro-immigrant
No.
policy proposal looks like, right? And so then people are going to say, it's like, well, so why did Biden do this thing that isn't even what progressives wanted out of immigration? Like, what was happening there? And the truth is, just look, like they had this agenda, right? Comprehensive immigration reform that they were supposed to be pushing for. They didn't have a feasible pathway to get it done. So then, like, a different immigration related problem arose and they were just paralyzed, right? Because instead of having like strong party institutions that could do things like say, oh shit, this immigration problem showed up. People are really upset. We need to like formulate a policy response to it. They had these groups with their pre-programmed agenda. So I'll note like Chris Murphy, senator from Connecticut, agree with him about some stuff, disagree with him about some other stuff. But a great thing that he did is that he actually took on the challenge of, can I negotiate a bipartisan bill to address this asylum problem? Like, can I just like ignore what I think immigration politics ought to be and look at what immigration politics are? And it was successful. He and James Langford, like they worked out a deal. Trump then scuttled the deal. By scuttling the deal, I mean, I think Trump scuttling that deal, had Harris won, people would have said that was the greatest favor that Trump ever did to Democrats, because it suddenly gave them something that they could say, right? But having something they could say about immigration arose from like actually trying to do something. And that just arose from tackling the problem on the merits, right? The whole time when crime was up, crime eventually went down, which is great. But when it was going up, the Biden administration never was like, crime is going up, which is bad, and here is our plan to make it go down. right? They said different things, and I was talking to a source who works at a fairly senior level of the administration, and she said at one point, some of them were like, we should formulate a crime plan. And so that kicked around the upper echelons. A word came back and was like, great idea, crime plan. But if you do it, you have to like get the civil rights and criminal justice reform groups on board.
Oh my God.
So then they went out and they started, workshopping and they couldn't come up with anything. So they just didn't do anything. Right. And it's like, it's politics. It's good to try to get people on board. But if you want to seem like you're taking a rising crime seriously, you have to like take it seriously, right? And just say like, we want to come up with a plan that we think is a good idea. And they didn't do that.
Why do you think more and more, especially in the Biden era, people listen to these groups that like ostensibly have no actual power or members? What do you think the shift is from that like kind of more big tent approach under the Obama administration to now? Is it mostly just that social media makes it so these groups seem like they have more power, that they'll give some quote to the New York Times that'll blow up on Twitter? Or is it also, I saw Ezra Klein was talking about this, that Biden was a much weaker party leader than Obama, and that kind of left a vacuum for these groups to take control? What do you see as the path from the Obama approach to the Biden approach to these groups?
It's like a little overdetermined, right? Like because one thing that people will sometimes say is, well, it's just Biden. He was weak. He was old, et cetera, et cetera. Now, on the other hand, he was the only person in the 2020 primary who like actually really did stand up to them. Somehow in 2019, he wasn't weak and old. It was Beto O'Rourke who was weak and old.
Yep.
And like actually old cranky Biden was like stiff arming these guys. And it was like, I was thinking, I was like, this is great. Like he's old school. He's old fashioned. Like he remembers how politics is supposed to be. But different things happened. Very unusual. He won the primary and then he fired his campaign manager and he brought on a higher profile Democratic Party operative, but who had like been objectively less successful. And so then he starts pivoting to the left. He starts courting Bernie Sanders, et cetera. I don't know why. I think the best explanation that I have, though, is that Democrats looked at 2016 when there was so much third-party voting, and they decided that most Americans reject Trump and that the key to beating Trump was just unity.
Right?
The
anti-Trump coalition.
Right. And that kind of set the tone. Then weakness, like, begets weakness. You guys are the wrong age for this analogy, but if you have a child, a toddler, or a bigger kid, kid's gonna say like, can I have a cookie? And you can give him a cookie if you want to. But if you say no, you can't have a cookie, the kid's gonna cry. And if you give the kid a cookie because he cried when you told him no, then anytime you tell him no about anything, it's going to be waterworks, right? And you're going to be in for hell to pay. And I think that Democrats got into that kind of bad dynamic with the groups. They taught the groups that whining and crying would be rewarded. And so that therefore their response to everything should be to whine and to cry. And just like being weak creates more weakness in that regard versus if you show people like, I just agree with you guys about many things. Like the reason I'm a Democrat is that on most issues, I have a mostly progressive worldview, and that's why you guys should support me. And I'm like, you can send me a memo if you have like a perspective on the merits, right? Like if you think I'm missing something and that you and your progressive friends have an idea that is going to be persuasive to me, like, please, like, here's my email address. Like, I want to hear it, but like, I'm not going to do things because you cried about it, right? Like that's not a reasonable way to do politics.
Yeah.
I feel like something that kind of relates to that I think about is, well, I'm not sure how true it was, but I was listening to like a podcast about the IRA. It was like a climate podcast. It's not like ultra political, but they were talking about it and how great of a bill it was. And they were saying like this was possible because there were and the way it was enacted because there were climate groups that were like creating and doing research about policy. So then if there ever was time for a climate bill, that it would be able to be implemented.
Mm.
And that kind of draws me to the broader perspective of like the IRA, like as opposed to crime, it's like that was a kind of like that's when Democrats were like seeking to address an issue that's like part of the like the party's broader goals, but is not like
Mhm.
something that was speaking to the public at the moment. There wasn't, it's not like, I don't know, there was like a hurricane that killed, thousands of people and people were like suddenly up in arms about climate. It was like, this is something that we as a party value. It's not necessarily what Americans care about at the moment, but it's not like something that's going to hurt us. Whereas on crime, it's like, this is going to hurt us if we don't do anything. So like as a political like actor and both like the parties in the administration, they have to say that like we choose when the groups have influence. We are not like we're the people who make the determinations for popularity, not like the groups, because those like of course somebody who cares about an issue is going to push for their perspective most strongly over everything else, even to the detriment of like the popularity of a party. So they need to like just realize what it means to like act on a political stage, even though it's so simple.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. It's just you gotta, I don't put it like taking responsibility is challenging in life, but elected officials need to do that. Somebody was telling me that they were working for their boss, and their boss took a position on Israel that a lot of the people in the staff didn't agree with, and like ultimately the chief of staff had to sit everybody down and be like, look, like it's not your name on the door, like we you work here because we want you to say what you think a good idea is. Like it's a functional organization. We want people's input, but like ultimately like the people who win the elections decide. But I think some of the Democrats in office have like not wanted to do that. They'll say to me, they'll say like as an excuse. I was talking to somebody about someone who used to work for Chuck Schumer, and they were talking about a permitting bill. And he was saying to me, he's like, Chuck and Nancy, like they really wanted to do this bill, but like the enviro groups killed it. And I was pushing back a little. I was like, they didn't kill it. Like you killed it. Like,
Mhm.
you let them kill it. You decided that their opposition would be decisive. And so you didn't do it. That's a reason. But, it's like the majority leader of the Senate. I don't want to say he single-handedly decides what happens, but in terms of like bipartisan bills, right? It's like he chose not to split his caucus, which is fine. I mean, that's a decision you can make, but like you got to own it. You have to accept responsibility.
Yeah. I think we all agree with that. I kind of wanted to tie this back into Joe Rogan. I
Yeah.
mean, that's kind of why. I mean, look, this whole discourse about the Joe Rogan of the left is so funny because I think a lot of Democrats are trying to not necessarily trying to find the Joe Rogan of the left. Spoiler alert, he was on the left
Hmm.
until, he, arguably so moved to the right on some issues, but even on like environmental issues, he's more left wing than the average like Democratic voter, I think, still on that. And
Hmm.
we know that you went on Joe Rogan, and I've listened to that episode. I think Ben, you've listened to that episode. And it kind of ties back to like this big tent stuff. And I remember what you said on Joe Rogan. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you guys were talking about like you went on Ben Shapiro's show.
Hmm.
And this was back in, I think, December of 2020. And Rogan was like, well, did you get any pushback? Like, oh, like there's so many people out there that don't want you to go on these people's shows because you're platforming them. And then what you said, and I think it was a perfect response, was that, hey, I'm going on their shows because these people have huge fucking audiences. And I'm trying to speak to their audiences, right? I want more people to read my stuff. And I think that's the whole mentality that I have with Rogan. And I think that we should have with these podcasters who aren't inherently political. Look, we're not going to agree with them. You're not like the whole argument about a Kamala Harris. I think one of the people on the Pod Save America, one of our campaign staff was like, though they were giving an excuse about why she didn't go on Joe Rogan. Man, I don't think it would have made a difference, obviously. But one of the guys goes, well, he's not political. And I was like, that's the reason why she should have went on Joe Rogan. And I think it would have been like a net positive. I don't think it would have done much. But I think at the end of the day, going on people's podcasts who aren't inherently political, that may not agree with you necessarily, can help A, humanize you, and then B, introduce you to a whole new audience that maybe hasn't heard that perspective before, right? And I just think that we like Ben, you brought up a really interesting about when Bernie went on Rogan in 2020.
Yeah, well, I assume part of why Rogan was asking that question is because of his experience when Bernie went on Rogan, and there was so much pushback to platforming someone with the biggest platform in the country. But I remember at that time, Matt, you were talking about how Biden was actually kind of more centrist and kind of pushed back against these groups when he ran in 2019 and 2020. But I remember there's a tweet when Bernie went on Joe Rogan where Biden was shitting on him for it. Biden was kind of using the lines of like,
Sure.
all the group response, and obviously some of that's bad faith, but I'm wondering, like, having been on Rogan 4 years ago, kind of how do you trace his evolution since then, and like how much of that was just kind of like being pushed out by the left versus just a natural like changing of views?
I mean, I'm not a deep
effort.
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, look, I'm not a deep Roganologist, but like literally,
kind of him.
That's
and
why we
whole,
brought you on here, Matthew. Come
but
on.
yeah.
Him and his whole vaguely political ilk, like not very political, the Theo Vaughns of the world.
I think a lot of left-wing people are not literal enough about this. But like what happened is Bernie Sanders went on the Joe Rogan experience, and Joe endorsed Bernie for president. Bernie at the time was running against other Democrats for the presidency. Naturally, those other Democrats wanted to beat Bernie in a primary. That's understandable. The Rogan endorsement was potentially big win for Bernie. So they were like, what are we going to do? How are we going to take this guy down? Well, it turned out that trans activists were really mad at Joe Rogan. And so everybody in the non-Bernie camp hopped on this view that Rogan's stance on trans women participation in mixed martial arts competitions was not only wrong, but was so wrong that it became second order wrong to even appear on his show. So if you're Joe Rogan and you hear that about yourself, that like, according to Democrats, it's not just that you are wrong on this issue, but that there is a chasm so vast that it's not even acceptable to appear on your show. You're just telling Joe Rogan to be a Republican, right?
Yeah.
And you're telling everyone who agrees with him about sports, which is 70% of the public, that they should vote Republican. Because it's always, look, you're always going to disagree with people about some stuff. But in this case, you're not saying, I'm going to agree with the majority of voters. You're not even saying, I'm going to take what I know is an unpopular position, but I'm going to ask you to respect me. You're going to say that holding the majority position on this question is so wrong that other people can't even appear on your show. So fortunately, most people did not hear that message as clearly as Joe Rogan heard it, or else Democrats would be losing elections 70-30 instead of 51-49. But like, at any rate, all's fair in love and war. You're trying to win a primary, right? But if you put that statement out about Rogan, the smart thing to do the day after you wrapped up the primary is like find a way to send a note over there and be like, hey guys, like
We're cool with you now.
Primary was tough. We maybe got a little hot here. Is there something we could talk about? Like, can we do something together?
A trip to the White House.
Because they mended fences with Bernie. Like Biden's camp tried to mend fences with Bernie, but they never tried to mend fences with Rogan. They never tried to account for their own sort of positions they took. And I just think Democrats have done a lot of that kind of thing, a lot of unconsciously engaged in a lot of this kind of deliberate tent narrowing. And, you know, it's fine to say that certain things are beyond the pale, but it can't be too many things.
Can't be a 70-30 issue.
And they can't be 70-30 issues, but it just also can't be too many. It's like you could say 3 things are beyond the pale, maybe, but like 7, 12.
I think you bring up a good point. You bring up a good point too, where I think a lot of these like purity testing, some of the issues we have that we've talked about, I think they started in bad faith. I was a big Bernie guy in 2020. I remember the purity tests on every candidate. Pete Buttigieg is like a CIA, whatever, and everyone is actually a fascist. Like all of this, and even Biden in the primary, I think it all started like kind of bad faith, just trying to win elections, and that they kind of never really like got out of that mode. They kind of like internalized it as not being bad faith and just actually just like morally righteous. And I wish we could just kind of stick to the bad faith use of it and kind of realize
Morally
that winning
righteous
elections-
is a good way to describe that. I
That's
didn't
like
thought,
something that frustrates me so much is when people talk about if anybody talks in like about like electoral politics and they bring up like Medicare for all, it just like it blows my brain because like we're so far from a political moment where that matters remotely that I'm like I can't understand thinking like that. Like it
Right.
hurts.
Well, I did Medicare for all. I mean, that's the flip side, right? It's like Bernie was putting forward all these litmus tests, right?
Yeah.
That were like really kind of crazy. And people were getting upset. And so then the
Mhm.
opportunity to sort of pull a Bernie on Bernie became like really, really tempting.
That's
and people
actually a really good way to describe it.
people who should have known better,
Mm.
you know, went in for it. People who, if you had just asked them, like, what's your philosophy of politics? Would have been like, no, it's like, you know, you got to be moderate, you got to have a big tent, etc. And then, you know, and then Bernie did the same thing. I mean, like he was so wounded by attacks from the left on cultural issues that he stopped standing up for what had historically been his approach, right?
Yes.
Which was to say, because he said this in the 2016 primary, Hillary was hitting him from the left on gun control. And he said, you know what? If we want to build a broad coalition to break the power of billionaires in America, which isn't necessarily what I would want to do, but it's what Bernie wanted to do. He was like, I need a big tent of people who are on board with that, right? And
On immigration too.
right. And procedurally, that's correct.
Yeah.
You have to decide, what do I think is the most important thing? And you got to pick. And then you got to say everything that's not the most important thing. Like I can still have an opinion on, but I'm going to treat it like it's less important. He moved away from that style of politics, right? So it's like he and Hillary were debating. Hillary was like, essentially like, we need to get more woke than Obama.
Yes.
And Bernie was like, we need to get more socialistic than Obama. And there were a lot of ill feelings. And both sides came out of that process deciding in 2020, it's like, we've got to do both. Right. So you wind up with a thing where it's like, you can't have like the Silicon Valley girl bosses, you know, Sheryl Sandberg, stuff like that. They're all kicked out of the coalition. You can't have like the woke, you know, like Kamala's brother-in-law, the Uber executive, black guy, you know, you got to them, right? Because it's all business people are evil. But then like also we have to pass like 11 speech codes and we can't have Joe Rogan and, you know, and so you wind up with just a tent that nobody's in it. And,
Yeah.
you know, that's no good.
I think if you merged Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders and got ultimately woke and socialist, you would end up with 70% in Miami-Dade and 40% Kentucky. It was just it was never really tried.
Yeah, it's
I'm
the
just
dream.
kidding.
Matthew, real quick. I just wanted to ask you a quick question. On the Brogressive Podcast right here, does Matthew Yglesias commit to going on Joe Rogan again? Would you go on Joe Rogan's podcast again? Because I really think that like your voice, especially in a world dominated by the right, a lot of his listeners are right wing now. That is true.
Of course.
I think it would be so important to hear someone like you.
Well, I'm ready to go on Rogan anytime. I mean,
Okay,
look,
we're ready to promote this.
I mean, to me, this is not like a question. I mean, I was trying to promote a book. No, it turns out the Joe Rogan audience does not really buy books. They
listen to podcasts for a reason, Matthew.
Yeah. I know. So it was not a super successful book promotional tactic, but you know, it sells Substacks, whatever. I will say, I mean, I'm more interested though in going on the Brogressive podcast. It's like we need a new generation of people. It's like nobody is ever going to be like the progressive Joe Rogan. Like that's dumb. But like we can have new things. You know,
we just need to make it so Joe Rogans of the world feel comfortable being vaguely progressive, not like trying to create one from scratch.
But also just we can cultivate more media voices of different kinds that are not like there's this particular style of like Tumblr communist who took over the media. And do you guys know what Tumblr is? Is that
Unfortunately.
Very
Yeah.
vaguely, very
Yeah,
vaguely.
vaguely.
I was like 12 and it was like kind of doing really well. I don't remember it too well,
Right. It's
though.
between I'm too old for Tumblr and you're too young.
Yeah.
But it was a nightmare, you know, and we can be bros. We can talk about the
Just throw it
Chargers.
out. Oh
Whatever.
my God. Can we please?
I see your little thing back
Dude,
there.
I'm so it was supposed to be a rebuild year.
Uh-huh.
Harbaugh just comes in and before we talk about the Chargers, I know Max did want to say one thing though, so I'm
I
sorry.
have
Okay.
been I have been dying to talk about this. I was trying to tie it in like 3 different times, but I'm just sitting here like. But anyways, so Matt, you and a couple other of some of my favorite writers. I mean, Noah Smith, I was kind of more a podcaster, but long story short, I've been hearing a lot about that abundance democratic agenda. I think you wrote a
Oh yeah.
specific like manifesto about that, and so that's been going through my brain for the last like week. My girlfriend's so tired of hearing me talk about it. I'm so glad you're here so we can actually talk about it. But so with all these power groups and what we've been talking about, right?
Yeah.
These groups that pushed for whatever messaging. I was thinking a lot about how you had written the Biden administration weighing getting rid of the Jones Act or the bipartisan permitting reform, but was too afraid to piss off the environmentalists. And that also led me to start thinking about how they didn't invite Musk to the electric vehicle summit. You spend a year talking about
This was the
electric vehicles,
stupidest fucking thing that's ever happened in
right?
politics.
No,
The Rogan thing was like a bad idea, but like this fucking people kept trying to tell them like talking about electric cars is unpopular. Just like don't do it.
Mhm.
But like Biden was like really determined to talk about electric cars for no good reason. And then was like, oh, but if we talk about electric cars, we're going to talk about Tesla and it's going to make the unions mad. So we should talk about electric cars in a way that excludes the top electric cars guy. And like, that's dumb. And it's not even that they should have invited Elon to the electric car summit, is that they just shouldn't have done it. Like, this just shouldn't have been an issue. Now, if somebody was like Joe Biden, jumping up and down, Joe Biden, can you please name an electric car company? Then like say like, yes, Tesla. That's the most important electric car company in America. But like also he like fucking Donald Trump doesn't ever talk about Tesla cars. Like he is campaign on a stage with Elon Musk and he's
Talks
not
about the
talking
rocket ships though. The rocket ships.
right, because rockets are cool.
They're cool.
It really makes me mad.
Well, it does. And I really thought, tying into everything we've talked about, I think a really good point to connect this to is like that, like you said, that abundance agenda. How can we, I guess, in your opinion, where can Democrats tie into this, these popular sentiments, these things people are upset about? You think
Yep.
electric vehicles, right? People want cheaper cars, they're upset about
Yep.
gas,
Sure.
housing or immigration or any of these things, rather than looking at it as like a fixed amount, as like a more is more, right? I think you in particular, you wrote about how you can go to San Antonio and you can buy a bigger house because that's what people want, right? But you can't get Medicaid there. And how do we tie that in away from the groups where it's like, pardon my French, but go fuck yourselves, guys. Like people want more houses, they want more money, they want more cars, they want more energy. We can't be shrinking the tent. How do you, I guess, where do you see that going in the future?
Uh-huh. I mean, I think that like whatever. I mean, you just have to just look at the issues on the merits. It's not that hard. There are Democrats who do it, who are trying to make the right moves on housing or on energy or other things
Ruben
like that.
Gallego.
Like Ruben. I mean, I think the big picture thing though is just that like economic growth is important, right? That, I think most Democrats, if you just sort of say the words, you're like, we need to care about the material self-interest of working class Americans. It's like, yes, that's correct. We do need to do that. And so it's like, yes, like that means Social Security. It means Medicare. It means like not letting companies dump pollution into the river. There's tons of stuff Republicans won't do, Democrats do, and that they should champion. But like also just like people want like a house and electricity and just like regular stuff. And like the economy and like when businesses open up in your town, that's good. That's just part of working class material self-interest. And you need to, do policy in an according way.
Okay, before we talk about the chart, I saw your tweet about the Commanders. That was so funny. The H-1B visas. Because I was like yelling. I'm like, dude, call a fucking timeout. Call a timeout.
I mean, I guess this is like I've obviously never been a quarterback in a high stakes football game. You
He's
have
a rookie too, but
you
the
have two rookie quarterbacks going after each other. But I did not. I mean, I'm glad. I'm a Commanders fan, so I was perfectly content with the Falcons to
oh yeah,
their clock management. But first, the Commanders fucked it. I mean, they went 3 and
yes,
out instead of doing anything to run down clock. It was all
yeah.
passes when
You
you
could
had
run
a lot
down
of
you
good.
gave them a minute and like what left, and
They had a lot of good options, and then the Falcons. It seemed like they just didn't know they had 2 timeouts.
you know what I think it was? I think they were trying to also maybe run down the clock. I think that's what it was, maybe, but it didn't make sense. There was only like what 20 seconds left.
I don't know. These things, I guess, happen sometimes.
How did you become a Commanders fan? I'm so sorry.
Well, I mean, I lived in Washington 21 years. No, unfortunately, I mean, because I'm old, right? So we only had in my whole time living in DC, I would say one season that I really felt good about. As we've been in the playoffs a couple times and stuff, but it was RG3's rookie season,
Yeah.
which would have happened when you guys were little children.
And
But
Jaden Daniels just broke the record last
Jaden
night.
just broke
Yeah.
his record. But so it's like, so I'm talking to my son, he's 9, right? And
Is he a Commanders fan too?
sort of, but he's a baby Commanders fan.
Okay.
This is like his first time through, but he's trying to like reason it through logically. And he's like, we've got a rookie quarterback who's really good. And so he'll be better next year and the year after
Yes.
that. And we can use our draft picks on some defense. And like the
Get
team's
this
going to
guy
get
in the
better and better.
NFL.
And I'm like, yes, buddy, you've got it. But then I was also like, but I remember when we had a rookie quarterback who was setting records and, he could do designed runs, he could do read options, he could scramble, and he could throw pretty good. And we were like, the franchise is fucking set. And his career was just wrecked by injuries in the short
Injuries,
term.
yeah.
And I'm old enough, I mean, to have a foot in this camp that this has always been one of the doubts about mobile quarterbacks in an NFL context, right? In a
Yes.
college context, you don't need to really worry about the longevity of your quarterback,
Yeah.
right? I mean, especially he comes on as a starter, maybe not even in his freshman year. If you can get 2-3 great years out of a mobile quarterback doing a read option offense, you're
It's
fucking
amazing.
golden
Yeah.
as long as you can keep getting those guys. Successful NFL franchises have a franchise quarterback who can play for 10, 15 years
Yes.
anchoring the team. I hope Jaden Daniels can be that guy.
Hey, looks like he can.
He has the skills to be that guy.
Yes.
But when your game relies so much on your foot speed and when you're putting yourself out there multiple, in his great drives yesterday and again last week,
It was his feet.
against the Eagles, he puts the ball, he doesn't just scramble. They use designed runs at critical moments,
Yes.
and that undermines the whole defensive scheme. It creates the passing. It's like, whatever. I'm not like a real football pundit, but like the fact is like there's a lot of injury risk when you play that way. And I hope for the best.
I think Lamar really changed the game for a lot of like quarterbacks who are very mobile, right? Because there were the same criticism our first year. I mean, I remember that the Chargers played him his rookie year in the playoffs. And you kind of saw that where he was only relying on his feet until the end of the game, and he just wasn't a dual threat enough when it came to actually throwing the ball. But then year 2, he practiced his throwing, got a lot better at that over and over, and now he's like an amazing. He's a great. He can pass the ball really well. He can go deep really well. I think that's kind of the call for Jaden Daniels, kind of Lamar's, and also kind of not taking those hits. And you kind of learn that over time. I think right now, like Caleb Williams, for example, with Chicago, he's taking a lot of hits. Part of it is because the O-line is ass, but also, he's just kind of putting himself in those situations. Justin Herbert, at least, I think it's the opposite with him, where he used to run the ball a lot more. And I think he kind of realized, hey, let's protect the big body. And they do a couple design runs for him, but not as much. But I'm happy you guys are in the playoffs. So I think we have the same record now. The Chargers and the Commanders. And I mean, I'm just praying right now we don't play the Ravens. Because if we play the Ravens, man, God, I love Wes Moore though. So part of me would root for the Ravens.
Oh my God.
Just
He talks about You're talking
Well,
about
also,
Wes Moore like every 5
if I'm
minutes.
if I'm not on Wes Moore's campaign in 2028, something went wrong. Because I'm
Wes,
already
well, also, the great state of Maryland is going to lose the commanders to DC.
Yeah.
Thanks to our recently passed continuing resolution.
Yeah. But Moore said he was okay with that. He said, it's fine.
I know. Well, because they got it's very funny that this was national politics because it is like sports. We traded them an Air National Guard wing for the football stadium.
Yeah, it was weird.
That's so funny.
Yeah, so they got like literally fighter jets, and we're getting a football team. And we're lucky in some ways that just like he's a Ravens fan, right? Because some Maryland politicians are like PG County guys, or from other southeast parts of the state, and they'd be Commanders fans who'd fight for it more. But like I think a Ravens fan governor is willing to purge the team. Try to pick up some.
He's a really big Ravens fan too. I mean, this guy was like, have you seen the video of him shotgunning a beer with some fans?
Yes.
And he didn't even know he was being recorded. I'm like, that's the guy we need in 2028, guys.
He's a cool guy. I mean, listen,
so cool.
I really like Westmore. I like a lot of these guys. The one thing I want to caution my fellow Democrats, particularly those of the Democrats who are like middle-aged women, is don't think that like vibes alone are going to address these issues. Like Wes Moore or Ruben Gallego or some of these other people, younger men of color, I think, especially in the Democratic Party, those are definitely the kind of guys who can do better and get more votes from men. Like that intuition is correct. But the reason those are the kind of guys who seem like they could get more votes from men is that you draw inferences from
about
like
men.
Wes Moore pounding beers about like what kinds of things he would say about stuff.
Yeah.
But in the course of a national campaign, you just like are forced to talk about a lot of stuff. And like what you say ultimately matters.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, just like, I mean, you think about it the other way, right? It's like if Republicans put Katie Britt seems like the kind of Republican who could get college educated women to vote for a Republican. And she is definitely the kind of politician who could do that. She's a middle-aged mom. Like, I feel like she and my wife might get along well, etc. Except actually they wouldn't get along well. Because once Katie Britt started expressing her opinions about American politics and public policy, they'd be like, what the fuck? Like, I hate you. And, so it just like, it matters. And like, I wrote a post about this, but like, Democrats should look at what are issues that there's big gender gaps on policy issues.
Yeah.
Because it's actually not women's rights.
No.
There is a gender gap on all questions, including ones directly related to women's rights. But the really big ones are about free speech, they're about nuclear energy, and they're about science and technology, right? And so if you want to be more appealing to men qua men without giving up on like the core progressive values, particularly the ones related to women and women's rights, it's like you should find people who talk about that stuff, who are excited about the future, who are excited about technology, who are excited about and who believe in free speech, which is a big one and connects to what we're saying about Rogan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and it might be that Wes Moore is the guy to do that. But it might be that
could be Gretchen Whitmer.
That it's Gretchen Whitmer, right? It might be that a woman can sell
this Midwest
the base
Lions
of Democratic
fan.
women on the idea that you need to be more chill and sort of like male appealing. And politics is confusing in certain ways.
Don't count out Big Gretch. I just don't think Democrats are going to pick a woman for a while, sadly. But
I think that's probably right. But it's just like, it's all politics.
More Gretch. I mean, it's pretty good.
It works. There's,
Max. Remember, I was floating that after, right, literally 2 seconds after the debate, I sent Max a graphic of Gretchen Whitmer and Wes Moore.
Yeah, I mean, it's all good. It's all good.
Talking about 2028, I do have one more question. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on JD Vance as a candidate and as a potential president? I saw that. I think it was from a couple of years ago before he started getting super into politics, but he had mentioned you as a writer that he reads. And so what are your thoughts on him how strong of a candidate do you think he would be, and him as a potential president as well?
The strength and weakness of JD Vance is that he at least used to be a dedicated reader of the Matthew Yglesias blog, and it's good. I to be not like because he just, secretly agrees with me, whatever, but like he is a smart, widely read person who is genuinely interested in politics and public policy, just like I am. So like there are a lot of writers who I read and who I follow, and I don't necessarily agree with them about you know what I mean? Because it's like when I was in high school, I used to go to the library and I would read The Nation and National Review and The New Republic and Reason, just like the small circulation political magazines, because I wanted to learn about politics and policy. I was really curious about that stuff. And Vance is like that, which gives him much more depth as a politician, as a thinker than most people have. It can also be dangerous because sometimes, a lot of times, the best thing to do in politics is to be a little shallow and superficial in your engagement about things. Like Donald Trump is not like a big ideas guy. And I think
he loves big ideas. What are you talking about,
I think
Matthew?
people like that about him. So Vance like might be too ideological to be really politically successful. Like, I'm not sure he's going to be able to pull off abortion is murder, but also if you want to murder your child in New Jersey, I have no problem with that.
He did a good job
right?
at the debate, though, with
He
that,
did.
with the abortion issue. Really, he did.
He did. I don't know, but it was Trump's playbook that he was executing.
Also,
right?
he wasn't the focal
when he becomes the coach, because that position that Trump landed on, which was really politically smart for him, it makes no sense, right? Like it doesn't withstand any kind of minimal scrutiny. And like a serious thinker is, I think, going to have more trouble like holding to that line in certain kinds of ways. But, he's smart, which I think can be underrated in politics. I think that Biden, Harris, Walz as like a 1, 2, 3 was like a slightly dopey bunch of people who Democrats rolled out in a row, kind of like nice pals, maybe like great senators from safe seats kind of thing, back slappers. Biden, at least of that group, was like kind of a real genius at like just like count the fucking votes, like get the bill done kind of politics. But in a president, you usually do want someone who seems impressive, in some kind of way that Obama does.
Yeah, the Obama effect.
Which I sometimes hear people just like gloss this as like Riz. And they'll say like Vance doesn't have the Riz, which is true.
But he sounds smart.
Right. There's just different ways to be impressive, I think. And it's good. I did I once had to participate in conducting job interviews. And the boss was giving us orders. He was like, this wasn't even job interviews. It was like, it was a trick. And he had the candidates just like have dinner with people. And he told them at the beginning, he's like, this is just dinner. This isn't part of the interview. You aren't being secretly graded. And then like when I was on the bus coming home, it was an email from the boss. He's like, I want you to secretly grade everyone who is at your table. And what he said was like, there's like the 7 following categories I want you to evaluate these people on, because I'm looking for people who spike on at least 3 of them. Right. It's like, and like Vance arguably like spikes in a couple ways. Right. Even if he's not, just like Trump is impressive in different ways from Obama, and Vance is impressive in different ways from either of those guys, but he seems impressive, and Moore strikes me as impressive again in a different set of ways. But just, it's like, in a really like lizard brain kind of way. It's like, who's going to lead the little hunter-gatherer band, right? And it's like, got to be someone who has some kind of extraordinary qualities, not just like, well, we're going to give
Josh Shapiro. I'm sorry.
Well,
he's impressive. He's impressive.
He's impressive in his own Right.
Not the
I just-
consensus builder. You know what I mean? Like
Yes,
there's a difference between who am I going to pick to like run the committee on the student council and like who am I
Yeah.
who am I going to pick to like kill a lion? And presidential election is more like that lion killing kind of exercise, I think. And you know, I don't know.
Shapiro's just too much of a nerd. I think that's my issue.
It does seem a little bit, you know.
I think
I mean,
people
we'll see.
like
We'll see
nerds.
what happens.
I wonder if Dems overcorrected in the Trump era and thinking like, oh, we shouldn't do someone who's very intellectual, and if that actually would have the contrast of that maybe would have been good.
Broadly
actually.
speaking, I think people discount that like voters have enough nuance to understand that people can be impressive in different ways. Like if you did
Yeah.
something good with your career, you have to like I don't know if it was Josh Riley, but it was some candidate in New York who was like trying to pretend he was like John Tester and like wore boots and acted all weird and like you don't have to do that. Like if you're impressive,
No,
like I feel like if you're a scientist who made some incredible discovery who's running for president, voters will like appreciate you for that. You don't have to like
yeah, that's a good
be
point.
impressive in one particular
Well, also
way.
just, you know, from a governor, I mean, the opportunity that any governor has is to say, like, this was a significant problem in my state, and I did this, and then we solved the problem, right? So I don't actually know that much about Pennsylvania, but like I know about like fixing the broken highway, right?
Yeah, that's what
Westmore with the bridge.
he
Yeah.
seems very gubernatorial. Like that's what I think of as Josh Shapiro, despite everything else
He's
I
a
know about him.
statesman. It's Shapiro's, yeah, he's more
So,
like a
you know,
statesman.
we'll see what it is, right? But it's like you don't want to just be like, well, I was like the perfect little student of my interest group coalition and I signed their bills robotically and that's why they all like me, right? So like, you know, Jared Polis, who I love, you know, if you just like look at him, like I don't know. I don't know. He doesn't seem like he has this like kind of alpha image that we normally have in presidents. It may just not be workable, but like I could tell you what he thinks about things and what he's done that is different from if you just selected a random Democrat and like teleported him into that job. It makes a difference that it's Jared Polis, not just it's quote unquote a Democrat, right? Like he has opinions, he has a point of view, he has things he's pushed, he said things he won't do. And that's kind of what you need.
Awesome. Well, I think if you do have a little more time, we want to do real quick rapid fire. Max,
Yeah,
a few
Max, take it
questions
away.
ready.
I like to believe that podcasts, they make you like the people that you don't otherwise like, introduce them to actually as people, unlike, you know, like a column or a tweet. So real quick, we do a humanizer segment. We get to actually know the real Matthew Yglesias. So what for 2024 for our listeners, what would be your top 2, top 3, whatever book, Substack recommendations? What publications should be people reading?
Besides yours.
You gotta read Slow Boring all the time. Shit, I didn't come prepared with anything. You know, I think like try to read some old books. I think
Any
it's
recommendations?
an underrated idea. I'm midway through reading Middlemarch right now, which because I care about politics, I'm just like reading this old ass British novel, and I'm like, I've got so many ideas based on this. I just think reading anything good will be generative for ideas and stuff. I really wish I really recommend Noah Smith's Substack. He's just like it's important to learn about policy issues and how to think things through. He's a really smart guy, creative guy. Doesn't write that much about politics per se, but he writes about the substance of the things that we're talking about in politics.
Max doesn't stop talking about him.
Dude, I love Noah Smith. I love his, like every time
We're
his
trying to
Substack-
get him on the podcast.
Okay, I'll tell him to do it.
Tell him.
Awesome. Okay, so then on the next one. So what, obviously you posted your top movies for 2024. Ben showed us you have a thriving, what's it called? The Letterboxd?
Letterboxd, yeah.
I love
So
your
did
letterbox.
Luigi, by the way. So did Luigi, supposedly.
Okay, well, anyways, so your top 3 movies of the year. Tell us what you loved about them. Tell them why they're your top 3 real quick.
Crap, what did I have? So Honora, I think is just like the best. It was just like a ton of fun, a lot of reality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Wild Robot was incredibly moving, like fun for the whole family, like it really it got me every which way. And then Dune 2, I just fucking love Dune. I love Denis Villeneuve. I thought it was so great when I heard Denis Villeneuve was taking on Dune. I was like afraid. I was like, how could this be as good as I'm building up in my mind? And it totally was. Just
Did you see
such a
Interstellar
genius.
again this year?
Yeah.
In the theaters? Yeah, that was my first time watching it. And I was high, but it was amazing. It was
I'm
so
not,
good.
I'm gonna go too long if I start talking about Interstellar.
We could have a whole
Real.
podcast episode about that.
We could do a whole episode on that. Okay, so in that same vein, I'm sure you see the comic books on the wall. I want to ask, what are your thoughts on that Superman 2025 teaser?
I really, it's hard to tell that much from a teaser, but I appreciated that they took the Richard Donner theme music and sort of like did the cover, right? So I like the idea of making a movie that will try to be in the spirit of that Donner 78 Superman rather than in the spirit of that Zack Snyder like dark
Yeah.
Superman. I think that a lot of people feel that like classic optimistic rosy Superman is naive and needs to be subverted in other kinds of ways, and I just don't think that that's right. I think that particularly in the Trump era, right? There's actually something very culturally dominant about cynicism and about the idea that like it's fake to criticize Trump for being such a corrupt scumbag because actually everybody is a corrupt scumbag. And the idea of believing in rightness of action and probity is actually edgy and interesting and meaningful. And I hope that that's what this movie is. All I actually know is that they did a good theme song.
All right, one last question. I know we're holding you long. I really like all your NBA takes. I think they're really interesting. First off, I know you're a Wizards fan. I'm a big Warriors fan. Hope you're enjoying the Jordan Poole experience. But I'm wondering, all the talk about the NBA ratings discourse. You're in charge of the NBA. You're the new commissioner. What couple steps or just one? What steps would you take to fix the ratings problem, long term or short term?
I mean, I wouldn't panic. I think they're just in a little bit of an odd transitional moment when, the most recognizable NBA players are well past their prime, when the very best players in the league, like Jokic and Doncic, aren't actually on the best teams. And so it's like you got to be a real NBA head to like know Donovan Mitchell at this point, right? And so that's just like a kind of these things happen, and so you gotta market the stars who are on the top teams. Like I think they know how to do it, but it takes time and reps a little bit.
I'm wondering if that's partly like the push for more parity has kind of like hindered that effort because a lot of those big stars had dynasties and that was part of it.
Yes, I know. I think that that's true, right? That there's a double-edged sword. Now, obviously, the NFL is the most successful thing in sports, and they have a lot of parity, a lot of instability, et cetera, et cetera.
True.
So they wanted that for the NBA to create a situation where having the best player in the league doesn't necessarily let you win a championship because you're not going to be able to sign other stars to play behind him. So, in a salary constrained second apron world, right? Like the actual way to build the best team is to make sure that you are getting with middling salaries, guys who are a little bit underpaid, right? But that's just not necessarily the most interesting team.
Yeah.
In an NBA context. And football is a little bit different from the NBA, right? It's like you don't go out there to like root for, okay, they've got like a fucking undervalued left guard, but he's really effective, right? But it's true, like that's team construction, right? It's like if your punter is a little bit better than average and you've got solid backups, defensive, it all helps. But like basketball has traditionally been like more art than science, and just like fucking amazing athletes out there on the floor crushing it. And the push for parity undermines that a little bit, but I think it'll work out. I think they should consider drawing the 3-point arc in a way that gets rid of the corner 3. I don't know
I
that
think that's an interesting
I
move.
don't know that the chess game of like trying to pass it to a guy who's open in the corner so that he can shoot a high expected value shot that only goes in 40% of the time is like that interesting. Right.
And
To
it's
just
making everyone play the same way too. Like,
yeah, but right. I mean, but just to remind ourselves, it's like what's the point of the 3-point line? Right. The idea was that it made the game more interesting because you had some people taking riskier shots. The corner 3 in this day and age, I think, doesn't make the game more interesting. We're not excited to see somebody kick it out to like a 3-and-D guy to take a, so I'd look at that. It's not the same as like Steph Curry sinking it from really deep.
yeah. All right, Adam Silver, watch out. It's coming for
Okay.
you.
The
we're
NFL
coming.
will always be the NFL will always be better, Adam Silver. I'm sorry.
Ha! We'll see.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Matt. This was awesome.
Okay, thank you. Take care.
Okay, well, thanks so much, listeners, to the Brogressive Podcast. This has been our interview with Matthew Yglesias. I got to say, awesome having such a big name on our podcast. Really kind of cool how this has been shaping up. I want to thank all the listeners who've been out there. I want to thank all the people who participated in the giveaway with Will Cooper. And I want to say Happy New Year to all the folks listening in the audience. And looking forward to another 2025 with my Brogressive hosts. This has been our Brogressive interview with Matthew Yglesias. Thanks so much, and we will catch you guys next time.